There we go. So it's great to see everyone. As Saul commented before I hit record, it's interesting that we don't have Torah study in the summer. So I jokingly commented even Torah scholars need a break, but the study of Torah keeps on happening, whether it's in a formal class like this or any other situation. That's we're supposed to be able to read and study the Torah on our own all the time. So this week's portion is Tetzei in the Tetzei. It's on page 1112. And in any other Chumash, you're looking for Deuteronomy chapter 21, beginning with verse 10. Or look in the table of contents for Tetzei in Deuteronomy. It'll tell you what page number we're at. So, Baruch atah. Wait, one more person coming in. So just let them connect to audio. There we go. Okay, so welcome everybody. So I was just about to say the bracha for Torah study. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam shekidshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. So as I said, the portion this week is Tetzei in the Tetzei 1112. In whatever Chumash you have, you're looking for Deuteronomy chapter 21, beginning with verse 10. So in context, Moses, throughout the book of Deuteronomy, is the premise is that it's Moses speaking to the people of Israel as they are about to enter the land of Israel after 40 years of wandering in the desert after the Exodus from Egypt. So I say the premise is that because the beginning of Deuteronomy back in chapter 1 tells us so. But the question that we ask as non-Orthodox Jews, so this is important to distinguish this. Orthodox Jews won't ask this question. They say whatever the Torah says must be historically accurate and true. Okay, so that's for Orthodox Jews. God gave the Torah to Moses at Mount Sinai in the form that you have in your hands, whether it's the Hertz Chumash or the Tetzei Chumash or whatever other Chumash you have. What is printed in it is what God gave to Moses at Mount Sinai. The problem, of course, arises in understanding that idea. Could God have actually given the entire Torah to Moses at Mount Sinai? Yes, of course, theoretically, God could have, but there are aspects of the Torah in the content of the Torah that call into question that idea. Why would God have given to Moses an account at the end of Deuteronomy of Moses' death? Or the other question, another possible question, why or was the world created in the way that chapter 1 of Genesis lays it out? So those are two of a number of questions that we raise based on that religious premise that God gave the Torah to Moses at Mount Sinai. So biblical scholars who are not tied by religion and Jewish perspectives, or even Jewish biblical scholars will look at the Torah through a literary lens and an academic lens, and allow themselves to ask questions. Does it make sense? So for our purposes, does it make sense that Deuteronomy was spoken by Moses to the people of Israel in Jordan, what is Jordan today, before they entered the land of Israel? And most scholars agree, no. Moses did not speak this book of Deuteronomy in its form. Most scholars agree that the book of Deuteronomy was written later than the other books of the Torah, which also could have been written much later than the Torah describes it at Mount Sinai. Okay, so all of that to say, and we've touched on aspects of this before in our prior Torah study sessions, but all of this is to say that as a conservative Jew and as a conservative rabbi, I have no problem saying that God did not give the Torah to Moses at Mount Sinai, and yet at the same time believe that the Torah is sacred and holy. Okay, so I view the Torah not as God's word, but rather as a group of people's understanding of what God's word could have been. In other words, understanding the Torah as divinely inspired, right? We might say that Shakespeare was divinely inspired because his literature is just so transcendent over any other kind of literature. And it's still read 500 years after he wrote it and still provides meaning and to people today. So I'm not comparing Torah to Shakespeare, but there are some English literature mavens who might say that Shakespeare's works are divinely inspired. So I would say that Torah is a level above Shakespeare in that people lead their lives according to the words of the Torah, based on the idea that the Torah is divine. There's something of God in the Torah, and by our studying of the Torah and following the dictates of the Torah, we are trying to connect to the divine. Okay, and that for me as a conservative rabbi, that is sufficient to provide authority and foundation for everything I do as a Jew today, and allows me to understand that if there are different manuscripts of the Torah around, which there are, right? Our text of the Torah goes back to the Aleppo Codex from Aleppo, Syria, from 1,000 years ago. There are texts of the Torah in the Dead Sea Scrolls, and there are some words there that are a little bit different. If I believe that the Torah came from God at Mount Sinai, then I would have a tremendous theological problem in reconciling the differences between the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Aleppo Codex. How could God's word have been miscommunicated or end up in different forms, right? As someone who believes that God did not write the Torah and give it to Moses at Mount Sinai, it's not a problem. It just reflects the different strands of tradition from the land of Israel to Syria, to there's also a Leningrad Codex, and to whatever other editions of the Torah that are around. It's not a problem. And there's the old Greek translation of the Torah and the entire Bible called the Septuagint, that's 2,000 years old, which reflects different words as well. And then there's the Samaritan Torah, which is called the Peshitta, which also has different language in it than our Torah. I have no problem with all these different versions, because the version that we have is, we know, at least 1,000 years old, and is based anyway on how the rabbis, everything we do Jewishly today is based on how the rabbis understand the Torah, and not literally on the Torah itself. Yes, Barbara?
The different Torahs, Are they significant different as far as meaning is concerned in translation?
So from the Dead Sea Scroll to the Aleppo Codex to the Septuagint, the Greek translation, to our so-called official version of the Torah, yes, there are some differences. Not in terms of law necessarily, but in terms of some elements of the story. So, for example, there is a story of Reuben taking the mandrakes from his mother to give to Jacob, so that it would prompt Jacob to go back to his mother Leah and to be with her. And the text in our version of the Torah is cryptic. I believe in the Septuagint and in the Samaritan version, there are some words there that fill in the blanks for us. And it's possible, though I don't know this for sure, that the Septuagint and the Samaritan might have an explanation of what happened with Cain and Abel, because the story in the Torah leaves it blank, right? Cain, right? We don't know why Cain killed Abel. It's cryptic in the text itself. So it's elements like that that are different. It's not like the Septuagint and the Samaritans say it's okay to eat pig, and our version of the Torah says it's not okay to eat pig. So it's nothing about law that's different. It's more about the story that is a little bit different. So I say all this just because of just to put us back in the context of Deuteronomy and understanding. And the most popular and accepted theory of the book of Deuteronomy is that it was written at some point in the time of the kings of Israel, perhaps through a segment of society that wanted Israel, the people of Israel, to return to God's ways. We know from the books of the Bible, from the books of Kings and the prophets, that the people of Israel, both Northern Kingdom and Southern Kingdom, were a wayward group of people, idol worshipers, some kings of Israel bringing idol worship into the temple in Jerusalem itself. So perhaps the book of Deuteronomy was a get back to the sources, get back to God kind of movement to try to convince the people to return to God's ways. Could be very likely. And there are other elements of the book of Deuteronomy that are different. There are laws here, like the law to have a king, which we read in last week's portion, which we didn't have in previous books of the Torah. So that also leads scholars to think that Deuteronomy was written at a different time. Also, the version of the Ten Commandments, which we read a couple of weeks ago in the portion of Va'et Hanan, also are slightly different. Like the reason for observing Shabbat in Exodus is about remembering creation or the Exodus, and in Deuteronomy it's about remembering Exodus or creation. I don't remember which one offhand, but Exodus has one, Deuteronomy has the other. Okay, and also Deuteronomy adds letting your slaves and maidservants rest on Shabbat, which Exodus doesn't have. Okay, so there are many differences. Those are just a couple. There are many differences between Deuteronomy and the rest of the Torah that, if for those who don't buy into God writing the Torah, is not a problem. It just leads to fascinating study and research to understand the origins of the book of Deuteronomy. But understanding again that as Jews today, we follow rabbinic tradition and rabbinic interpretation of Torah and not the literal text of the Torah itself. Okay, so that's very important to keep in mind, that it doesn't matter really what the words of the Torah say. What matters is what the rabbis interpret from those words. Okay, and that could be problematic for some people. What are you saying? But we're going to see an example of this right here at the beginning of the Torah, of this portion. Okay, so two things I want to say. Well, one thing I want to add before we start reading from the beginning of the portion, and that is to highlight this idea that we are rabbinic Jews today, and that Judaism today is just the next, just a continuation of rabbinic interpretation of Torah. This portion, Ki Tetzei, has the most commandments of any of the portions in the entire Torah. So when we derive the 613 commandments, 74 of them are from this portion. That's by far the most of commandments of any of the portions. 27 of them are positive commandments, that is, do this, do that. And 47 are negative. Don't do this, don't do that. Okay, so 74 commandments derived from this portion. Okay, so let's begin reading this portion, and we'll get to this idea that for the rabbis, it doesn't necessarily matter what the words of the Torah says. What matters is how the rabbis interpret those words. Okay, so the portion begins. Tetzei lamilchama al oivecha, when you go out to war against your enemy. So I'm translating literally myself. You can follow along in the English translation that you have in front of you. Unetano, and God presents that enemy. Unetano Adonai Elohecha biyadecha, and God presents that enemy in your hand. Vishavita shivyo, and you take captive. You take some of them captive. Vera'ita b'shivya, and you saw among the captives Eshet Yafat Toar, a beautiful woman. V'chashaktava, and you desired her. V'lakachta lecha leisha, and you take her for wife. Okay, so this is what the Torah is telling us, is that when you go to war against your enemy, you're allowed to take captives, and you're even allowed to marry captive women, captive non-Jewish women, because clearly non-Jewish, because the only people you're going to war against are non-Israelites. So clearly from the Torah, you're allowed to marry non-Israelite captive women. V'haveta el toch beitecha, bring her into your home. V'gilchat rosha, shave her head. V'asta et siporneha, and do her nails. I think the English would say pare her nails, but literally it means do her nails, whatever that means. V'hesira et simlat shivya, take off her captive garment, me'aleha, from off of her. V'yashva, meaning give her regular clothes. V'yashva b'veitecha, she'll sit in your home. Uvachta et aviha ve'et iman, she should mourn or cry over her parents. Yerach yamim, a month of days, 30 days. V'achar kain tavo eleha uve'alta, and after that 30 days of mourning is done, then you can go to her and take her as wife. V'hayita lecha leisha, and she should be a wife to you. So you desire a beautiful captive woman. You can't take her right away. You have to put her in regular clothes. You have to shave her head. You have to do her nails. So make her unattractive. Allow her to mourn, which further makes her unattractive. And then after those 30 days, then you can marry her. So then at the end of those 30 days, you could marry her, but you decide that you don't want her. And you send her out, release her. Umachor lotim karena b'chasef, you cannot sell her for money. Lotit amer ba, tachat asher inita, you must not enslave her, since you had your will of her. Right? You had your chance. You had taken her from captivity, taken her into your home. You allowed her to mourn her parents. And at that time, you changed your mind. Too bad. You can't make any money off of her. You have to release her to captivity, to freedom. Release her to freedom. Now, verse 15, the story continues. And according to the commentary, this paragraph is related to the paragraph I'm about to read, which is related to the third paragraph I'm about to read. So the commentary suggests that even though these are three different laws, you'll see in a moment that they could be, the rabbis are connecting them as one continuous story. Ki tiyena la'ish, if a man has shtei nashim, two wives, ha'achat ahuva, one is beloved, v'ha'achat snua, and one is not beloved or hated, disliked, let's say disliked, v'yaldu lo vanim, and they give him sons. Well, I'll translate it literally as sons. It could be children, but sons. So a man has two wives. One he loves a lot, and one he doesn't love so much. And both of them give him children. Ha'ahuva v'hasnua, the loved one and the not loved one. V'haya haben habachur lasniya. So happens that the oldest child, the oldest son, comes from the not loved wife. V'haya biyom hanchilo et banav, and on the day that you want to claim legacy, like who's going to inherit from you, et asher yelo, from what will be from him that will become property to his children, right? That's I'm expanding this. So it's right. You write your will on the day that you write your will. Okay. Lo yuchal livaker et ben ha'ahuva al pnei ben hasnuah bachur. When you write your will, you're not allowed to make a younger child who happens to be the oldest son from your loved wife. You can't allow that son to become the oldest child and take in your will what rightfully belongs to the oldest child. Okay, so let me just explain. Oldest child inherits double from what other children inherit. So I have an acre of land. I have two sons. No, I'll have three sons. My oldest son gets half an acre. The other two sons share the other half acre. They each get a quarter of an acre. Okay? That's how that works. Oldest son gets the double portion. So I did the math as easily as I could for a non-math major. 1 acre of land, you pass on to your children. Half acre goes to the oldest. The other half acre divided equally among the rest of the children. Okay? If you want to make the oldest child of the loved one, who is not your oldest child, you are not allowed to do that. That's what this law is saying. Ki et habachor ben hasnua yakir latet lo pishnayim b'chol asher yimatzeh lo, because the oldest, who is from the hated wife, will recognize, you should recognize, to give him the double portion that should be found with him. Kihu reshit ono, he is the first of his produce, of his progeny. Lo mishpat habechora, to him belongs the primogeniture law. Okay, so that's this law. So the first law is what to do with a captive woman that you want to take for your wife. Second is what to do with children of both a loved and a not beloved wife, and to ensure that oldest child, no matter which wife they're from, gets their due. And then the third law, which we'll see right away, is a difficult law, a challenging law. Ki ela ish, if a man has ben sorer umoreh, a wayward and defiant child. So a man has a wayward and defiant child, and then ushomea bekol aviv, he doesn't listen to the voice of his father, uvekol imo, and the voice of his mother. He's a disobedient child. The yisru oto velo yishma aleihem, and they discipline him, and he still doesn't obey them. So what do you do with this wayward, defiant child who does not respond to discipline? V'tafsu bo aviv v'imo, his parents take him, grab him, v'hotziu oto el ziknei iro, and they take him, they bring him out to the elders of his city, the el sha'ar mekomo, and to the gate of his place. The amru el ziknei iro, and they, that is the parents, say to the elders of the city, B'neinu zeh, this child, our child, this one, sorer umoreh, he's wayward and defiant. And then ushomea bekolenu, he refuses to listen to us. Zolel v'soveh, he is a glutton and a drunkard. Urigamuhu kol anshe iro va'avanim, all the men of the city shall stone him with stones. Uvamet, so stone him with stones until he dies, so stone him to death. Uviarta hara mikirbecha, and you eradicate the evil from your midst. The Chol Yisrael yishmeu v'yirau, and all of Israel should listen and be afraid. Okay. So it seems from reading these three laws, 3 of the 74 laws that this portion contains, that they are distinct. They stand on their own. The commentary suggests the following. If you fall in love with a captive woman, she's the one you love, and you have another wife at home who is not the beloved wife. So the woman that you fall in love with in the first paragraph becomes your beloved wife, who then the wife you already had becomes your non-beloved wife, but you have a child from the non-beloved wife who you don't want to have as the main one to inherit. That child who now is no longer beloved in your eyes because you have other children through this new wife that you fell in love with, that child that you no longer love becomes this defiant child. So the commentary connects the 3 paragraphs in this way. Okay, if we want to, we can, but we don't need to. It just adds another layer to the story to make it a narrative instead of individual laws that we might be learning. But be that as it may, this 3rd paragraph about the wayward child is a complicated law. And what the rabbis were dumbfounded by this. Why would God teach that you're permitted, in some cases, to take your child to be stoned to death? No matter how wayward your child is, that child is still yours, right? So there have been books written about the Columbine, Colorado school massacre, right? Which now, who remembers Columbine anymore when the focus is on the elementary school in Uvalde, Texas, right? That's the tragedy of American life today. But Columbine, Colorado, which happened, 20 years ago, something like that, just was the preeminent school massacre at the time that led to people try to understand who this person was, this student was, who just flipped and shot with a submachine gun fellow classmates. So there have been novels written about this, and I don't remember the names right now, but there's one very creepy, very, very good novel, I just don't remember the name offhand, which tries to portray the love these parents had for this child, and throughout the child's development, how there was something clearly wrong with this child, but still parents love the child nonetheless. So it just reflects, I'm just using that as an example. It just reflects, we love our children no matter what, right? And we can't imagine, no matter what our children have done, God forbid, we can't imagine ever handing them over to be stoned to death. It's just not something parents do. So why would God allow such a thing to happen? That's what the rabbis ask. And this is my point, an example par excellence of how the rabbis disregard what the Torah says. And instead of saying, well, they do say that this could happen. But as Barbara knows and Rita knows from Talmud class from a number of years ago, we studied the section in the Talmud which studied this section from the Torah. And that section in the Talmud added so many conditions to what's presented here in the Torah that makes it nearly impossible to be ever observed, right? So they say both parents have to be alive and the child has to be defiant of both parents. Okay, so the child is not defiant just to one parent, but defiant to both. How old is this child? Well, because of the word ben, well, first of all, it's just a son, not a girl. Okay, so it's only your son that this could happen to, not your daughter. The son has to be between the age of 12 and 1 day and 12 and 6 months. That, for the rabbis, is the time frame that this law is talking about. So just a 6-month period, all right, defiant of both parents, and glutton and drunkard. Also, the rabbis say specifically what kind of food he is a glutton of, and that's a particular kind of meat, right? So if he's a glutton of tofu, then it doesn't count. A glutton of chicken doesn't count. Only glutton of a particular kind of meat, and drunkard on a particular kind of wine. Could be drunk on beer, could be drunk on whiskey. It's okay. You don't apply this law. But drunk on this particular kind of Italian wine, okay. So drunk on the Italian wine, glutton on a particular cut of meat, between the ages of 12 and 1 day and 12 and 6 months, then if that's such a case, then we can take this child out to be executed. So, and then the rabbis never had the authority to execute anyone anyway. So in all intents and purposes, they're saying this law never was. But some rabbis say these are the conditions. Other rabbis say outright, this law never was meant to be followed and never will be followed. So they take that radical step to say that this law is here in the Torah just to study and to inspire parents and children to be good parents and children. That's why the law is here. And it teaches the extreme in order to instill fear, fear of parents and fear of God into the community. But again, the rabbis take the radical step, some rabbis do, to say that this law was never meant to be followed and never will be followed. So the rabbis do that here, and they do that with the Sota law back in the book of Numbers from the portion Naso, the husband who suspects his wife of adultery or being unfaithful in some way is allowed to bring his wife to the temple in Jerusalem for this Sota ceremony. Some rabbis said that never was and never will be. And then also with the laws of eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, the rabbis say that's not meant to be taken literally. You don't chop off someone's hand. Rather, it's meant to be monetary compensation. So those are just 3 examples of many examples in which the rabbis reinterpret the words of the text to develop new law and new meaning. And again, for the literalists in the Jewish community, the more fundamental among us, that would be a radical thing to do. Those so-called Torah true Jews who claim to want to get back to the roots and to understand Torah as it was originally intended, even they follow the Talmud and claim that they would never do the rebellious child law. They would never execute a rebellious child. So these so-called Torah true Jews, are not Torah true, literally. They are Torah true based on how the rabbis interpret the Torah. Okay, so we have to understand when it comes to Judaism and the interpretation of Judaism from the fundamental to the most reform, we follow rabbinic interpretations of Torah. We do not follow literal interpretations of Torah. There are Christian fundamentalists, evangelicals, and others who do read the Bible, including the Jewish Bible, literally, and follow the Bible literally. That is not a Jewish way of understanding Bible and Torah. Okay, so I know I've said this before, and it just, for me, it's just important to reiterate and the radical nature of the rabbis, and to give us rabbis today and other leaders, legal scholars in the Jewish community today, the right and authority to continue to interpret the text of the Torah, that it's not a one-shot interpretation in the time of the rabbis in the Mishnah and the Talmud, but it's an ongoing process. Okay, so with that, I want to go on to another law in the Torah that leads to some interesting response of the rabbis. So on page 1116, which is Deuteronomy 22, beginning with verse 6. So whatever edition of Chumash you're in, it's in the second Aliyah, chapter 22, beginning with verse 6. So on page, in the Eitz Chaim 1116, the bottom of the page. So just another random law in a series of random laws. Ki karei kan sipor lefanecha. If you come up, if you encounter a bird's nest in front of you, baderech, on the way, whatever path you're on, b'chol eitz o al haaretz. If it's in a tree, if you come up to it in a tree, like you happen to be climbing a tree to be harvesting fruit, maybe, or whatever reason you're climbing the tree to prune the tree, whatever, you come across a bird's nest, or if you see the bird's nest on the ground, efrochim o beitzim, with chicks or eggs in it, v'ha'em rovetzet al ha'efrochim, and the mother is sitting over the chicks, o al ha'beitzim, on the eggs. So I don't know if this happens when the nest is on the ground, if the mother bird would still be with the eggs if the nest is on the ground, but certainly in the tree, mother bird is with the eggs or with the chicks, okay, or the fledglings, okay. Lo tikach ha'em al habanim. You don't take the mother with the young, okay. Shaleach teshalach et ha'em ve'et habanim tikach lach. You have to send the mother bird away, shoo the mother bird away, and then you can take the eggs or the fledglings. Laman yitav lach, so that you do this so that it'll be good for you, v'ha'arachta yamim, and your days will be lengthened. Okay, so it seems pretty compassionate, that we are compassionate to animals and birds in nature, and we understand a potential suffering that mother animals could have for their children. So you cannot alleviate your hunger or your monetary desires by the potential sale or consumption of these eggs or fledglings if the mother bird is there. So your desire does not outweigh the compassion you're supposed to have to the mother bird. So that's a beautiful law, and makes sense from a Jewish religious context of what Judaism teaches: compassion to all God's creatures. Right? Makes total sense. So there's a story in the Mishnah, or that's told in the Talmud, of rabbis coming out of the academy one day and seeing a boy climb a tree and finding a bird's nest and shooing the mother bird away. So the rabbis see this child fulfilling this mitzvah, one of the 613 commandments. And as he's shooing the mother bird away, the child falls out of the tree and dies, going against what the law says. If you follow the law, it'll be good for you and you'll have length of days. Where's the length of days for this child? The child dies right on the spot. So it seems to go against the Torah. Child's following the law of the Torah and dies in the process of fulfilling the mitzvah. How could that be? So if you look in the commentary of the page, it raises, on the bottom of 1117, it raises major theological questions about good and evil in the world and understanding, right, that if the rabbis understand, which they do, if we follow the laws, then God will bless us. And if we don't follow the laws, then God will punish us. Then all good things that happen to us are because we've followed God's laws. All bad things that happen to us is because we don't follow God's laws. What could have the child done wrong to warrant being killed by God? That's how the rabbis understand it. Everything that happens to us is God's direction. God is active in this world, and whatever happens to us, happens to us. God knew that Jules would be thirsty right at this moment and would take a sip from his thermos, right? It's not free will on Jules's part, according to the rabbis, but rather God knew that Jules would be thirsty, and therefore he took a sip. And I'm just using Jules as an example of what's happening on my Zoom screen as we speak, right? So it seems it presents major theological problems. What happens when bad things happen to good people? And it prompted one of the students in the academy today, the brilliant student of Rabbi Meir, Elisha Ben Abuya, to totally leave Judaism and become an apostate, because he could not reconcile what played out before him and to the other rabbis, right? So the question of good and evil we're not going to solve today, and I've talked about it before, but it calls into question God's role here. It seems pretty clear from the Torah: follow in God's ways, shoo the mother bird away, it'll be good for you. Don't follow in God's ways, don't shoo the mother bird away, it'll be bad for you. And leaves us with this challenge: well, what happens if we follow God's laws, and it's bad for us? Okay. So any questions or comments about that? There are plenty of other laws in Tetzei, like the next law about needing to build a parapet on new construction on the roof to make sure that people don't fall off, and plenty of other laws here that all connect to having a just and compassionate society. So I think that's the beauty of the portion Tetzei, that we're learning mostly about how to have a just and compassionate society that reflects God's image in all of us, and say it this way, that how we act towards our fellow human being reflects the idea that all of us have God's image, reflect God's image in all of us. Okay, so we'll stop here for today. Wish everybody a good rest of the day, and be well, everybody. Take care.